Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping back into a world that seems both impossibly distant and strangely familiar. Not the polished vision of gaslights and grand balls, but the real, gritty truth of ordinary Victorian life. You won't find romanticized parlor scenes here, or sanitized history book illustrations. Just the daily existence of millions who lived, worked, suffered, and somehow found moments of joy between the year 1837 and 1901. If these quiet glimpses into the past help you drift into dreams, you can like and subscribe, but only if they truly calm your mind. And if you'd like to help our peaceful historical channel grow, your support means more than you imagine. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, the time on your clock, and if you still have a little sleepy curiosity remaining, send it our way. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. So, dim the lights. Let the fog of Victorian London settle around you. Settle in, and let's begin with what life was really like for ordinary Victorians. The Victorian era stretches across more than 6 decades, from the moment young Victoria took the throne in 1837 until her death in 1901. It was an age of contradictions so profound they seem almost impossible. Britain became the wealthiest, most powerful nation on earth, dominating global trade and ruling an empire upon which the sun never set. Yet in the shadows of that magnificence, in the narrow streets and cramped rooms of industrial cities, millions lived in conditions that would shock modern sensibilities. The same nation that built grand museums and magnificent railway networks allowed children to crawl through coal mines and families to live 12 to a room. The era that gave us Charles Dickens and the Great Exhibition also gave us workhouses and cholera epidemics. When we speak of ordinary Victorians, we're talking about the vast majority who weren't lords or ladies, who never dined in drawing rooms or traveled in private carriages. We're talking about the working class, the poor, the people whose labor built Victorian Britain, but who rarely appear in the glossy history books except as background figures in someone else's story. These were factory workers and domestic servants, agricultural laborers and street sellers, seamstresses and miners, dock workers and washerwomen. They made up roughly 80% of the population, and their lives were defined not by leisure and refinement, but by work, want, and the constant struggle to survive another day. The Victorian age saw Britain transform from a largely agricultural society into the world's first industrial nation. Millions migrated from countryside to city, drawn by the promise of work in the new factories and mills. The population exploded, doubling from 20 million in 1837 to over 42 million by 1901. Cities swelled beyond their capacity to house or feed their inhabitants. London alone grew to become the largest city in the world, a sprawling metropolis of both wealth and desperate poverty existing side by side, sometimes separated by nothing more than a single street. This was the age of steam and steel, of railways that connected the nation and steamships that connected the world. It was the age of gaslight and telegraph, of photography and the first public libraries. Yet it was also an age when life expectancy at birth hovered around 40 years, when infectious disease killed thousands in periodic waves, when working a 14-hour day 6 days a week was normal, and when a bad harvest or a factory closure could mean starvation. The Victorians themselves were aware of these contradictions, though they didn't always know how to resolve them. Social reformers, politicians, and philanthropists wrestled with what came to be called the social question. How could a nation so rich contain such poverty? How could progress and suffering coexist so intimately? Some blamed the poor themselves, believing poverty reflected moral failure. Others recognized that the system itself was broken, that industrialization had created problems faster than solutions could be found. What made someone ordinary in Victorian Britain was not just their lack of wealth or status, but their vulnerability. Ordinary people lived precarious lives, always one illness, one accident, one economic downturn away from destitution. They had no safety nets, no unemployment insurance, no health care except what charity or the dreaded workhouse might provide. They worked because they had to, and they died young more often than not, worn out by labor, disease, or simple exhaustion. And yet, within these harsh realities, ordinary Victorians found ways to live. They formed communities, celebrated what little they had, cared for each other in times of need, and passed down stories and songs that gave meaning to their struggles. They were not merely victims of their age, but people who adapted, resisted, endured, and occasionally even thrived within the constraints of their world. Their lives were not simple or easy, but they were rich in complexity, filled with the same hopes and fears, loves and losses that define human existence in any era. This is their story, or as much as we can piece together from records and reminiscences, from investigators' reports and workers' testimonies, from the novels and newspapers that captured fragments of their daily existence. It's a story that begins not with grand events, but with the most basic question: where do you lay your head at night? Your home, if you can call it that, depends entirely on whether you found work in the city or remained in the countryside, and whether fortune has smiled even slightly upon you. For those who flooded into Victorian cities seeking employment in the new factories and workshops, housing was scarce, expensive, and often barely habitable. The cities simply hadn't been built to accommodate such rapid population growth. As a result, neighborhoods that had once housed a few hundred people now crammed in thousands, with families packed into spaces never meant for human habitation. In the industrial cities of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and especially London, the working poor lived in what were called back-to-back houses. These were exactly what they sound like: rows of houses built directly against each other, with no rear access, no back windows, and often no ventilation except through the front door. A typical back-to-back consisted of 2 or perhaps 3 small rooms stacked vertically. The ground floor room served as everything: kitchen, living space, and often bedroom for some family members. A narrow, steep staircase led to 1 or 2 rooms above. Sometimes there was a cellar below, cold, damp, and dark, which might house yet more family members or be sublet to another family entirely. These houses were constructed cheaply and quickly, built right up against each other in long, unbroken terraces. Streets were narrow, often only 8 or 10 feet wide, creating dark canyons where sunlight rarely reached. The air hung heavy with smoke from countless coal fires, mixed with the stench from overflowing privies, rotting garbage, and open sewers. In the worst slums, families lived not in whole houses, but in single rooms within larger buildings. A room measuring perhaps 12 by 12 feet might house a family of 6, 8, or even 10 people. Everyone slept in that one room, ate in that one room, lived their entire domestic existence in that one room. Privacy was an unimaginable luxury. Parents shared beds with children. Siblings slept head to foot. And, in the worst cases, lodgers were taken in to help pay the rent, meaning strangers shared sleeping space with families. Furniture was minimal. A bed, if they were fortunate, though often it was simply a straw mattress or pile of rags on the floor. Perhaps a table and a chair or two. A few pots and pans for cooking. Clothing hung on nails driven into walls. Possessions were few because there was nowhere to keep them and no money to acquire them. What little people owned was practical, necessary, worn until it literally fell apart. Water was a precious commodity. Most slum dwellings had no running water. Instead, residents drew water from communal standpipes or pumps in the street, often shared by dozens of families. These might only run for a few hours each day, leading to long queues and sometimes fights over access. The water itself was frequently contaminated, drawn from rivers polluted with sewage and industrial waste, though people had no way of knowing this until the connection between contaminated water and disease like cholera was finally understood in the 1850s. Sanitation was even worse. Most slum houses shared outdoor privies, simple holes in the ground over cesspits. These privies might serve dozens of families and were rarely emptied often enough. They overflowed, especially after rain, creating pools of sewage in yards and streets. Some houses had no privies at all, forcing residents to use communal dung heaps or simply relieve themselves wherever they could. The smell was overwhelming, ever-present, and inescapable. In some of the very worst rookeries, as the most notorious slum areas were called, conditions descended into something almost beyond belief. Whole families lived in cellars below street level, dark spaces that flooded with every rain, where walls ran with moisture and floors were perpetually damp. In such places, tuberculosis, the disease Victorians called consumption, spread easily. So did typhoid, typhus, and a host of respiratory ailments. Light came only from candles or, if you could afford it, a small oil lamp. But candles and oil cost money, so most people simply lived by daylight as much as possible and sat in darkness after the sun set. In winter, when days were short, this meant long evening hours in cold, dark rooms. Heating was equally problematic. Coal provided warmth, but coal cost money, and it had to be carried up narrow stairs and stored somewhere in already cramped spaces. Many people burned just enough coal to cook their meager meals, huddling around the small fire for warmth before banking it at night. On the coldest winter nights, children might all sleep in one bed, sharing body heat, while parents tried to stay warm with whatever blankets or coats they possessed. The sounds of slum life were constant. Thin walls meant you heard everything from neighboring rooms and houses. Arguments, crying children, coughing fits that went on for hours. The sounds of people living out their intimate lives with no buffer of privacy. From the street came the cries of vendors selling their wares, the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones, the sounds of horses, dogs, and pigs that still roamed many poor neighborhoods. At night there were different sounds, the footsteps of night soil men emptying cesspits, the watch calling out the hours, drunks singing or fighting in the streets. Yet for all their horrors, these places were home. People made what they could of them. Women scrubbed their doorsteps, trying to maintain some sense of cleanliness and respectability, even when surrounded by filth. They hung washing from windows, tended small plants in pots, did everything they could to make their cramped spaces livable. Neighbors knew each other, helped each other, quarreled and made up, created communities even in the worst conditions. Children played in the streets because there was nowhere else, making games out of whatever they could find. Rural housing was different but not necessarily better. Agricultural laborers lived in small cottages, often tied to their employment, meaning they could be evicted if they lost their job or displeased their employer. These cottages might have 2 or 3 rooms, slightly more space than urban workers enjoyed, but they too suffered from dampness, poor construction, and lack of sanitation. Water came from wells or streams, which could be far from the cottage, requiring someone to carry heavy buckets back and forth multiple times a day. Heating and cooking were done on the same fire, usually in a large fireplace that might be the cottage's only source of warmth. Country cottages had earth floors in some regions, which turned to mud when wet. Thatched roofs leaked, letting in rain and providing homes for vermin. Windows were small and sometimes had no glass, just shutters that had to be closed against weather, leaving the interior dark. Yet country life had some advantages. There was fresh air, at least, room to grow vegetables in a garden patch, often a pig or some chickens that could supplement the family's food. Rural children had fields to play in rather than filthy streets. The pace of life was slower, governed by seasons and daylight rather than factory whistles. Some working families, the fortunate ones, lived in what were called model dwellings or improved housing built by philanthropic organizations or enlightened employers. These were designed with better ventilation, proper drainage, and more adequate space. But such housing was limited and often came with strict rules about behavior, cleanliness, and even which church you attended. And the rent, though subsidized, was still beyond the reach of the very poor. The middle class, that growing segment of Victorian society, lived very differently. Their homes had multiple rooms, servants' quarters, parlors for entertaining, and gardens. But ordinary Victorians, the ones we're concerned with tonight, never saw the inside of such places except as servants, and then only in the kitchen and work areas, never the family spaces. For them, home was small, dark, cold in winter, stifling in summer, always too crowded, never quite clean no matter how hard you tried. It was the place you fell into at the end of an exhausting day, where you slept a few hours before rising to do it all again. It was the place where children were born, where the sick suffered, where the old died. It wasn't much, but it was what you had, and you defended it fiercely against anyone who tried to take even that away. Because without a home, no matter how poor, you were truly destitute. You were workhouse-bound, the fate everyone dreaded most. So you paid your rent, somehow, even when it meant going hungry. You kept your room as best you could. You endured the cold, the damp, the smell, the noise, the crowding. You endured because you had no choice. And because hidden within these difficult conditions were the small moments that made life bearable. A child's laughter, a kind word from a neighbor, the brief warmth of a fire on a cold night, the satisfaction of a clean doorstep that said, no matter what else is true, someone cares for this place. Someone lives here. This is home. The rhythm of Victorian working life was relentless. For the ordinary worker, life was defined by labor. Long hours of hard physical work that began early and ended late. 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. There were no vacations, no sick days, no such thing as workers' rights for most of the era. You worked or you starved. It was that simple. If you were a man working in a factory, your day began before dawn. In textile mills, in iron foundries, in workshops and manufactories across industrial Britain, you reported by 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier. The factory whistle or bell called you to work, and you'd better be there when it sounded, or you'd be fined or turned away. The workday stretched for 12, 13, sometimes 14 hours. You ate your meals at your station, if they let you stop at all. The machines never rested, and neither did you. Factory work was dangerous. Machines had no safety guards, no emergency stops. Fingers, hands, even arms could be caught in spinning mechanisms. Children who worked in textile mills, and there were thousands of them, crawled under running machines to clear cotton threads or pick up dropped materials. Deaths and maimings were common, and there was no compensation, no insurance, no help for families left without a breadwinner. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar of machinery that left workers partially deaf. The air was full of cotton fibers, coal dust, or chemical fumes, depending on what was being manufactured. Lung diseases were endemic. Respiration problems started young and only grew worse with years of exposure. In coal mines, the work was even more brutal. Miners descended into the earth, sometimes crawling through passages so narrow they could barely fit, to hack coal from the seams with picks and shovels. The air was thick with coal dust. Explosions from pockets of gas killed dozens at a time. Roof collapses were common. Men worked in darkness, illuminated only by small safety lamps, in heat that made them strip to the waist, in water that might be ankle or knee-deep. Coal mining created its own diseases. Black lung from inhaling coal dust destroyed men's ability to breathe, usually in their 40s or 50s, leaving them unable to work and dependent on family or charity. Miners' wives knew their husbands might not come home any day, killed in an accident deep underground. Women who didn't work in factories often worked in domestic service. By 1900, nearly a third of all women between 15 and 20 worked as servants. This meant living in your employer's house, usually in a tiny room in the attic or cellar, rising at 5 or 6 to light fires, heat water, prepare breakfast. Your day was filled with scrubbing, dusting, washing, cooking, serving, and cleaning up, all while remaining as invisible as possible. Good servants were seen but not heard. You spoke when spoken to, kept your eyes down, and never, ever complained. The work was exhausting, and the hours were whatever your employer decided they should be. A servant might work from early morning until late at night with only brief breaks. There was little privacy, little freedom, and wages were low. But for many young women from poor families, service was preferable to factory work. At least you had a roof over your head and regular meals. At least you weren't on the streets. For those not in factories or service, there were countless other occupations. Agricultural laborers still made up a large portion of the workforce, especially in the first half of the Victorian era. Farm work followed the seasons. Plowing, sowing, harvesting, each had its time. The labor was backbreaking, working with tools that had changed little for centuries, hauling, lifting, digging from dawn to dusk. Wages were among the lowest of any work, and employment was seasonal. Winter months brought hardship when there was little work to be found. In cities, thousands worked as street sellers, the costermongers who pushed barrows or carried trays, crying out their wares. They sold everything imaginable: hot pies and eels, oysters and whelks, fruit and vegetables, flowers, matches, rat poison, second-hand clothes, old books, broken metal, and bottles. These sellers worked in all weather, walking miles each day, earning pennies. Some specialized: the pie man, the milk seller, the lavender woman, each with their distinctive cry that residents learned to recognize. This was precarious work. A bad day meant no income, and bad days came often. Other workers labored at specialized trades. Cobblers mended shoes. Tailors made and repaired clothes. Washerwomen took in laundry and scrubbed it by hand in tubs of hot water, wringing out heavy, wet fabric until their hands were raw. There were knife grinders who walked the streets with their whetstones, chimney sweeps who sent small boys up narrow flues to scrape out soot, rag and bone men who collected anything that could be sold or recycled. Dock workers in port cities unloaded ships, heavy, dangerous work that was often casual, meaning you lined up each morning hoping to be chosen for a day's labor. If you weren't chosen, you earned nothing. If you were, you might work 16 or 18 hours straight when a ship was in, only to have no work again for days afterward. Child labor was pervasive in the early Victorian period. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories, in mines, as chimney sweeps, in domestic service. They worked long hours for even lower wages than adults, and their small size made them useful in spaces adults couldn't access. A common sight in textile mills was young children, some barely old enough to walk, crawling under dangerous machinery. In coal mines, young children pulled carts loaded with coal through low tunnels, crawling on hands and knees with a chain between their legs attached to the cart behind them. They worked in darkness, in fear, for hours on end. It wasn't until mid-century that laws began to limit child labor, first in mines, then gradually in factories. But enforcement was lax, and poor families depended on their children's wages to survive. Education laws that made schooling compulsory didn't come until 1880, and even then, many children worked before and after school, or were kept home when their labor was needed. The working week stretched across 6 full days. Most workers had Sunday off, not by choice, but by law and custom. Sunday was for church, for rest, for mending clothes and preparing for the week ahead. It was the one day you might not work, though for many, especially servants, there was still work to be done even on the Sabbath. Wages varied widely depending on your work and your skill. A skilled London coachmaker might earn 5 guineas a week, a small fortune for a working man. Railway conductors kept 4 shillings a day from the fares they collected. Omnibus drivers made 34 shillings a week, but worked from 7 in the morning until past midnight. Factory workers earned less, perhaps 12 to 15 shillings a week for men, less for women and children. Agricultural laborers at the bottom of the wage scale might make 9 or 10 shillings a week. From these meager earnings came rent, which might take a third to half of your income. Then food, clothing, coal, everything else. There was rarely anything left. Most working families lived week to week, often day to day. If you earned a bit extra, you might buy something you needed, a pair of boots, a blanket, though usually such purchases required saving over months. More often, any extra money went to the pawn shop when times were especially hard, to be reclaimed when and if you could. Women's wages were always lower than men's, even for the same work. It was assumed women didn't need to support themselves, that they had fathers or husbands to provide for them. This, of course, was often untrue, leaving widows, unmarried women, and wives of drunken or incapacitated husbands to support families on wages calculated for a supplement, not a living. Some working-class families managed a degree of modest comfort. If the primary breadwinner had steady work, if no one got sick, if there were no accidents or sudden expenses, you could eat regularly, keep your rent paid, even save a little. But such security was fragile. One illness, one injury, one factory closure, and the family could spiral into poverty from which recovery was nearly impossible. The fear of the workhouse haunted working people. The workhouse, established under the Poor Law of 1834, was the destination for those who could no longer support themselves. It was designed to be deterrent, harsh enough that people would do anything to avoid it. Families were split up, men separated from women, parents from children. Inmates wore uniforms, ate poor food, and performed hard labor in exchange for their keep. Going to the workhouse meant you had failed, lost everything, and it carried a stigma that lasted even if you managed to leave. So people worked. They worked when they were sick, when they were exhausted, when they were injured. They sent their children to work. They took jobs that were dangerous, demeaning, backbreaking, because the alternative was worse. They endured conditions that would be illegal today, that were recognized even then as inhuman by some observers, but that continued because the system depended on cheap labor, and there were always more workers desperate enough to accept any wage, any conditions. Yet within this grinding system, workers found ways to maintain dignity. They took pride in skilled work well done. They formed unions, though these were often suppressed and membership could cost you your job. They supported each other, collected pennies for a workmate who was injured or a family that had lost their wage earner. They passed down skills from parent to child, maintained traditions of craftsmanship, even in the age of machines. They were not merely cogs in the industrial machine, though the system often treated them as such. They were people with hopes and fears, with families they loved, with desires for something better. Most would never escape the working class, would never know anything but labor and want. But they kept working, kept trying, kept surviving, because that's what people do. They endure. And sometimes, in small ways, they resist, even if that resistance is simply maintaining your humanity in conditions designed to strip it away. If your work was hard, and it was, at least you could count on eating something at the end of the day. What you ate, though, depended entirely on what you could afford. And for most ordinary Victorians, the diet was monotonous, filling, but not particularly nutritious, and sometimes barely adequate to sustain life. Bread was the foundation of the working-class diet. Not the soft white bread we know today, but dense, heavy loaves made from coarse flour. It was dark, sometimes gritty, but it was cheap and it filled your belly. A typical working family might consume several pounds of bread each day. You ate it with whatever else you could afford, which often wasn't much. Tea was the other staple. By mid-Victorian times, tea had become affordable even for the poor, though the tea itself was often weak, with leaves being used and reused until they gave nothing more than brown-colored water. You added milk if you could get it, and sugar if you had any. Tea was drunk multiple times a day, hot liquid that warmed you and gave you something to go with your bread. For many of the poorest, bread and tea constituted the entire diet, day after day, week after week. This was subsistence, not nourishment, and it showed in the stunted growth and poor health of those who lived on nothing else. If you had a bit more money, you could supplement bread and tea with other items. Potatoes were cheap and filling. You boiled them, mashed them, fried them if you had any fat. Onions were another common addition, cheap and flavorful. Together, bread, tea, potatoes, and onions formed the core diet of millions. Meat was the marker of a decent living. If you could afford meat, even occasionally, you were doing better than most. For the working poor, meat might appear once a week, usually Sunday dinner. You'd buy the cheapest cuts, shin and cheek from the butcher, pieces other people didn't want. These could be stewed slowly with vegetables to make them tender, creating a meal that felt substantial. Offal, the organs of slaughtered animals, was cheap and widely eaten. Liver and onions became a working-class standard. Sheep's trotters, pig's head, all the parts of animals that wealthier people discarded were purchased and consumed by those who couldn't afford better cuts. Some of the poorest bought meat that was going bad, tainted pieces sold at a discount by unscrupulous butchers. You cooked it thoroughly and hoped the taste and smell disguised its condition. Fish was more accessible than meat in many places. Red herring, heavily salted and smoked, kept well and was available year-round. You could buy it from street sellers, and a single herring, split among family members, added flavor to an otherwise bland meal. Sprats, eels, and shellfish like oysters, mussels, and whelks were cheap protein sources. Oysters, which we think of as a luxury today, were so common and inexpensive that they were considered poor people's food. Street vendors sold them from carts, and people ate them raw by the dozen. Fried fish, though not yet paired with chips in the familiar combination, was sold as street food. Cooking facilities shaped what people could eat. Many slum dwellings had only a single fireplace or small grate for both heating and cooking. You couldn't roast a joint of meat even if you could afford one. You had to boil or fry everything in pots over the fire. Some families didn't even have proper cooking facilities and lived on food bought ready-cooked from street vendors: meat pies, hot peas, baked potatoes, fish. This was expensive relative to cooking at home, but if you had no stove and no pots, you had no choice. There were no refrigerators, no way to keep food fresh. You bought what you needed daily, in small quantities. Milk, if you could get it, was bought fresh each morning from a milk seller who walked the streets with cans. By afternoon, it might be starting to turn, especially in summer. Butter and cheese had to be bought and used quickly. Vegetables wilted, meat spoiled. So you planned your week around when you were paid and what was available. Saturday was shopping day for many families, when wages were paid. You'd buy your groceries from various sources: a bit of meat from the butcher, vegetables from a market stall or street seller, bread from a baker, though many poor families couldn't afford baker's bread and bought cheaper loaves from small shops or made their own if they had an oven. Tea, sugar, and other staples came from the grocer, often bought on credit during the week to be paid off on Saturday. Food quality was often poor. Adulteration was rampant. Flour was mixed with chalk or alum to make it whiter. Tea was bulked out with used leaves, dried and resold. Milk was watered down. Butter was mixed with cheaper fats. Bread contained substances that shouldn't have been there. There was no regulation, no inspection, no protection for consumers until late in the Victorian era. You ate what you could afford and hoped it wouldn't make you sick. The diet varied by region. In northern industrial towns, people relied heavily on oatmeal, making porridge or oatcakes. In southern agricultural areas, wheat bread was more common. Coastal communities ate more fish. Rural areas had access to eggs from their own chickens, milk from a cow if they were fortunate enough to keep one, vegetables from their gardens. But urban workers, cut off from the countryside, depended entirely on what they could purchase, and city prices were often higher than rural ones. Street food was everywhere in Victorian cities. Walking home from work, you passed sellers of all kinds. Hot pies filled with meat or fruit. Baked potatoes sold from cans kept warm by charcoal. Sheep's trotters in vinegar. Pea soup ladled into cups. Pickled whelks and jellied eels. Roasted chestnuts in autumn. Gingerbread and hard candy for children. If you had a penny, you could buy something to take the edge off your hunger. These street foods were important for working people. They were convenient, affordable in small quantities, and they provided variety in an otherwise monotonous diet. The sellers themselves were often poor, making their living from tiny profit margins, walking miles each day to sell their wares. Children often went hungry. Even in families where adults ate adequately, children might be given less or be given the parts of meals adults didn't want. Bread and milk or bread and tea might be all a child ate for days on end. This stunted growth and development, leaving generations of working-class children smaller and weaker than their better-fed middle-class counterparts. Seasonal variation affected everyone. Summer brought fresh vegetables and fruits at lower prices. Winter meant root vegetables and preserved foods. Spring, the time before winter stores ran out and summer abundance arrived, was called the hungry gap, when food was most scarce and prices highest. During these times, the poorest might skip meals entirely, eating once a day instead of twice, giving what food there was to children or working adults. As the Victorian era progressed, imported foods became more common. Tinned meat from Argentina, Australia, and New Zealand appeared in shops, affordable and long-lasting. Condensed milk in tins meant you didn't need fresh milk. These seemed like improvements, but the tinned foods were often high in salt and fat, and the convenience came at a nutritional cost. Sugar consumption increased dramatically when the sugar tax was reduced. But this led to tooth decay so severe that by 1900, many working-class adults had lost most of their teeth, making it difficult to eat fresh vegetables and fruits that required chewing. Alcohol was its own category. Beer was safer to drink than water in many places, since the brewing process killed bacteria. Weak beer was consumed regularly, even by children. Gin was cheap and provided an escape from the hardships of daily life, though it also caused its own problems. Public houses, pubs, were social centers where working men gathered, sometimes spending money that should have gone to feed their families. Drunkenness was a serious social problem, though it's worth noting that the Victorians' concerns about working-class drinking were often exaggerated by middle-class reformers who saw alcohol as a moral failing rather than understanding it as one of the few pleasures available to people whose lives offered little else. There were efforts to improve working-class diet. Soup kitchens operated by charities provided free meals to the destitute. Penny dinners were organized, where children could get a hot meal for a penny. Cookery schools tried to teach working-class women how to make nutritious meals on tiny budgets, though these efforts often failed to account for the reality of having no proper kitchen, no money for ingredients, and no time after a 12-hour workday to cook an elaborate meal. For all its inadequacies, the Victorian working-class diet kept people alive, kept them working, sustained families through generations. It wasn't good nutrition by modern standards, and it contributed to many health problems, but it was what people had. They made the best of it, stretching pennies as far as they would go, sharing when neighbors had less, saving a special treat for Sunday or a holiday. Food was fuel, sustenance, but it was also one of life's few pleasures, and even the poorest tried to make their meals something more than mere survival. What you wore in Victorian times announced your place in society before you ever said a word. Clothing showed your class, your respectability, and whether you were managing to get by or slipping into poverty. For ordinary people, clothing choices were shaped by practicality, cost, and the constant need to appear respectable, because looking too poor could mean losing what little dignity and status you had. Working-class men dressed in simple, sturdy garments built to survive hard labor. Their trousers were usually made from thick cotton, moleskin, or cheap wool in dark colors that hid dirt. Shirts were coarse cotton or flannel and worn until they were almost falling apart. A waistcoat, if you could afford one, added a layer of warmth and a hint of respectability. Outdoor clothing was often limited to a single jacket or coat, worn all year in every weather condition. Almost every man wore a flat cap, a practical and inexpensive piece of headgear so common it became a symbol of the working class. Boots were valuable and expensive, repaired over and over to make them last. Others wore weak shoes that wore out quickly, and the poorest went barefoot, even through cold winters in crowded cities. Working women dressed with the same practicality. They wore simple dresses or a skirt and blouse made from cotton or wool in dark, plain colors such as brown, black, or navy. An apron protected their clothing during long hours of work. Instead of a proper coat, many women used a shawl, which was cheaper but offered little protection from cold or rain. Hair was covered with a bonnet or scarf. Underclothing was minimal, a shift or chemise, a petticoat, and sometimes a simple, functional corset. Clothing needed to be decent, durable, and washable, if you had the means to wash it regularly. Most working people owned very few garments. You might have one outfit for labor and one set for Sunday if things were going well. Children wore hand-me-downs from older siblings. Babies were wrapped in whatever scraps or fabric were available. Specialized clothing for different seasons or activities simply didn't exist. You wore whatever you had for everything. Second-hand clothing was a huge part of life. Garments passed from owner to owner, sold and resold in bustling used clothing markets. Many working people never owned anything new at all. Everything they wore had belonged to others first. Mending was constant and essential. Evenings were spent darning socks, sewing patches onto trousers, and turning collars and cuffs to make shirts last longer. Mothers often took apart worn-out adult clothing to transform them into garments for children. Every scrap of fabric was reused. When something was finally beyond repair, it was sold to a rag-and-bone man who passed the material along to be turned into paper or other goods. Sunday clothes were treated differently. If you hoped to maintain any sense of respectability, you kept a set of Sunday best reserved for church and special occasions. These were cleaner, less worn, and meant to show the world that you still had standards. Men might wear a decent suit, often second-hand. Women wore a nicer dress with a bit of lace or trim and a better bonnet. Children were washed, tidied, and dressed in their least worn clothing. The sight of working-class families walking to church on Sunday mornings in their best garments was a quiet declaration. We may be poor, but we are not defeated. Footwear brought particular hardship. Boots wore down quickly because walking was a constant part of daily life. Walking to work, walking during work, walking to the market, and walking to collect water. When the soles wore through, water and cold seeped in. You could pay a cobbler to resole them, but that cost money many families didn't have. Footwear was both essential and painfully expensive, and making it last as long as possible. What you wore in Victorian times announced your place in society before you ever said a word. Clothing showed your class, your respectability, and whether you were managing to get by or slipping into poverty. For ordinary people, clothing choices were shaped by practicality, cost, and the constant need to appear respectable, because looking too poor could mean losing what little dignity and status you had. Working-class men dressed in simple, sturdy garments built to survive hard labor. Their trousers were usually made from thick cotton, moleskin, or cheap wool in dark colors that hid dirt. Shirts were coarse cotton or flannel and worn until they were almost falling apart. A waistcoat, if you could afford one, added a layer of warmth and a hint of respectability. Outdoor clothing was often limited to a single jacket or coat, worn all year in every weather condition. Almost every man wore a flat cap, a practical and inexpensive piece of headgear so common it became a symbol of the working class. Boots were valuable and expensive, repaired over and over to make them last. Others wore weak shoes that wore out quickly, and the poorest went barefoot, even through cold winters in crowded cities. Working women dressed with the same practicality. They wore simple dresses or a skirt and blouse made from cotton or wool in dark, plain colors, such as brown, black, or navy. An apron protected their clothing during long hours of work. Instead of a proper coat, many women used a shawl, which was cheaper but offered little protection from cold or rain. Hair was covered with a bonnet or scarf. Underclothing was minimal: a shift or chemise, a petticoat, and sometimes a simple, functional corset. Clothing needed to be decent, durable, and washable, if you had the means to wash it regularly. Most working people owned very few garments. You might have one outfit for labor and one set for Sunday if things were going well. Children wore hand-me-downs from older siblings. Babies were wrapped in whatever scraps or fabric were available. Specialized clothing for different seasons or activities simply didn't exist. You wore whatever you had for everything. Second-hand clothing was a huge part of life. Garments passed from owner to owner, sold and resold in bustling used clothing markets. Many working people never owned anything new at all. Everything they wore had belonged to others first. Mending was constant and essential. Evenings were spent darning socks, sewing patches onto trousers, and turning collars and cuffs to make shirts last longer. Mothers often took apart worn-out adult clothing to transform it into garments for children. Every scrap of fabric was reused. When something was finally beyond repair, it was sold to a rag and bone man who passed the material along to be turned into paper or other goods. Sunday clothes were treated differently. If you hoped to maintain any sense of respectability, you kept a set of Sunday best reserved for church and special occasions. These were cleaner, less worn, and meant to show the world that you still had standards. Men might wear a decent suit, often second-hand. Women wore a nicer dress with a bit of lace or trim and a better bonnet. Children were washed, tidied, and dressed in their least worn clothing. The sight of working-class families walking to church on Sunday mornings in their best garments was a quiet declaration. We may be poor, but we are not defeated. Footwear brought particular hardship. Boots wore down quickly because walking was a constant part of daily life. Walking to work, walking during work, walking to the market, and walking to collect water. When the soles wore through, water and cold seeped in. You could pay a cobbler to resole them, but that cost money many families didn't have. Footwear was both essential and painfully expensive, and making it last as long as possible was a constant struggle. What you wore in Victorian times announced your place in society before you ever said a word. Clothing showed your class, your respectability, and whether you were managing to get by or slipping into poverty. For ordinary people, clothing choices were shaped by practicality, cost, and the constant need to appear respectable, because looking too poor could mean losing what little dignity and status you had. Working-class men dressed in simple, sturdy garments built to survive hard labor. Their trousers were usually made from thick cotton, moleskin, or cheap wool in dark colors that hid dirt. Shirts were coarse cotton or flannel and worn until they were almost falling apart. A waistcoat, if you could afford one, added a layer of warmth and a hint of respectability. Outdoor clothing was often limited to a single jacket or coat, worn all year in every weather condition. Almost every man wore a flat cap, a practical and inexpensive piece of headgear so common it became a symbol of the working class. Boots were valuable and expensive, repaired over and over to make them last. Others wore weak shoes that wore out quickly, and the poorest went barefoot, even through cold winters in crowded cities. Working women dressed with the same practicality. They wore simple dresses or a skirt and blouse made from cotton or wool in dark, plain colors, such as brown, black, or navy. An apron protected their clothing during long hours of work. Instead of a proper coat, many women used a shawl, which was cheaper but offered little protection from cold or rain. Hair was covered with a bonnet or scarf. Underclothing was minimal: a shift or chemise, a petticoat, and sometimes a simple, functional corset. Clothing needed to be decent, durable, and washable, if you had the means to wash it regularly. Most working people owned very few garments. You might have one outfit for labor and one set for Sunday if things were going well. Children wore hand-me-downs from older siblings. Babies were wrapped in whatever scraps or fabric were available. Specialized clothing for different seasons or activities simply didn't exist. You wore whatever you had for everything. Second-hand clothing was a huge part of life. Garments passed from owner to owner, sold and resold in bustling used clothing markets. Many working people never owned anything new at all. Everything they wore had belonged to others first. Mending was constant and essential. Evenings were spent darning socks, sewing patches onto trousers, and turning collars and cuffs to make shirts last longer. Mothers often took apart worn-out adult clothing to transform it into garments for children. Every scrap of fabric was reused. When something was finally beyond repair, it was sold to a rag-and-bone man who passed the material along to be turned into paper or other goods. Sunday clothes were treated differently. If you hoped to maintain any sense of respectability, you kept a set of Sunday best reserved for church and special occasions. These were cleaner, less worn, and meant to show the world that you still had standards. Men might wear a decent suit, often second-hand. Women wore a nicer dress with a bit of lace or trim and a better bonnet. Children were washed, tidied, and dressed in their least worn clothing. The sight of working-class families walking to church on Sunday mornings in their best garments was a quiet declaration: we may be poor, but we are not defeated. Footwear brought particular hardship. Boots wore down quickly because walking was a constant part of daily life. Walking to work, walking during work, walking to the market, and walking to collect water. When the soles wore through, water and cold seeped in. You could pay a cobbler to resole them, but that cost money many families didn't have. Footwear was both essential and painfully expensive, and making it last as long as possible was a constant struggle. The constant companion of ordinary Victorians was illness. Disease was everywhere, striking without warning, killing the young and the old with disturbing regularity. For working people, sickness meant more than physical suffering. It meant loss of income, and loss of income meant potential destitution. There was no safety net, no sick pay, no healthcare system to catch you when you fell. Victorian cities were breeding grounds for disease. Overcrowding meant infections spread rapidly. Contaminated water carried cholera and typhoid. Poor ventilation and coal smoke filled the air with particles that caused respiratory problems. Inadequate nutrition weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to every passing illness. The death rate in industrial cities far exceeded that in rural areas, and the poorest districts had the highest death rates of all. Cholera was the most feared epidemic disease. It struck in waves, arriving suddenly, killing thousands, and then disappearing for years before returning. The cholera epidemics of 1831, 1848, and 1854 were devastating. People who were healthy at breakfast might be dead by nightfall. The disease caused violent vomiting and diarrhea, dehydration, and death within hours. No one knew how it spread until Dr. John Snow's investigation in 1854 proved that contaminated water was the source. Even then, the miasma theory, the belief that bad air caused disease, persisted for years. Tuberculosis, called consumption, killed more people than cholera, but did so slowly. It affected the lungs primarily, causing a long, wasting decline. Those with tuberculosis coughed constantly, lost weight, grew weak, and eventually died, often after months or years of suffering. It was particularly common among young women and among the working class who lived in poorly ventilated spaces and were undernourished. There was no cure, no effective treatment. Rest, good food, and fresh air were recommended, but working people couldn't afford rest, couldn't afford good food, and fresh air was scarce in industrial cities. Typhoid and typhus, often confused but actually different diseases, were also common. Both caused high fevers, both could kill. Typhoid was spread through contaminated food and water. Typhus by body lice that thrived in overcrowded, unwashed conditions. Outbreaks occurred regularly, especially in slums. Influenza struck in epidemics, killing the vulnerable, the very young, the old, those already weakened by other conditions. Smallpox, though vaccination had been discovered, still killed thousands. Many poor people didn't get vaccinated, either because they couldn't afford it, didn't trust it, or simply never had access to it. Childhood diseases were so common they were almost expected. Measles, mumps, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, these struck children regularly. Some recovered, many didn't. It was common for families to lose several children to disease. Parents learned not to become too attached to infants, knowing the likelihood that they wouldn't survive. Infant mortality was staggering, with up to a third of children dying before their 5th birthday in the worst periods and places. Other ailments were equally debilitating, if less immediately fatal. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, left children with deformed bones, bowed legs, stunted growth. It was so common among urban working-class children that it was almost normal. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, anemia from iron deficiency, countless nutrition-related problems weakened people even when they didn't die from them. Occupational diseases were their own category. Miners developed black lung from breathing coal dust. Grinders and potters developed respiratory problems from the dust in their workplaces. Factory workers suffered from exposure to chemicals and dyes. Dressmakers and tailors developed vision problems from working by poor light. The repetitive motions and poor ergonomics of industrial work caused chronic pain, joint problems, spinal issues. By middle age, most working people's bodies bore the marks of their labor. Accidents were common and often catastrophic. A man who lost a hand or arm in a factory accident couldn't work, couldn't support his family. A woman who fell and broke a leg might be permanently lame. There were no industrial safety regulations, no compensation. If you were injured, you lost your job, and that was the end of it. Medical care for ordinary people was limited and expensive. Doctors charged fees that working families couldn't afford. If you got sick, you might try home remedies first, things passed down through generations, herbal preparations, poultices, folk cures. Some worked, many didn't. If home remedies failed, you might seek out a chemist who could sell you medicines without requiring you to see a doctor. The problem was that many of these medicines were useless or even harmful. Patent medicines, sold with extravagant claims, contained alcohol, opium, or other substances that provided temporary relief but no cure. Some were poisonous. There was no regulation, no testing, no requirement that medicines actually do what they claimed. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was sold openly and used for everything from toothaches to coughs to fussy babies. It was addictive and dangerous, but it was cheap and available, so people used it. Other medicines contained mercury, arsenic, or other toxic substances. The green dye in wallpaper contained arsenic and poisoned whole families. Bread was sometimes adulterated with alum, a toxic substance that made flour appear whiter. People were being poisoned by everyday items without knowing it. For those who absolutely couldn't afford medical care, there were charitable dispensaries that provided free treatment. But these were overwhelmed and could only help a fraction of those in need. Hospitals existed, but they were often seen as places you went to die, not to get better. Hospital conditions were filthy. Infections spread rapidly, and surgery without anesthesia or antisepsis was brutal and frequently fatal. The truly desperate ended up in workhouse infirmaries, where the medical care was minimal and the stigma enormous. Women faced particular health challenges. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died in labor or from infections afterward. There were no antibiotics, no blood transfusions, no surgical interventions that could save a life when things went wrong. Midwives attended most births among the working class, but their training varied wildly, and they had few tools beyond experience and their hands. Multiple pregnancies, often spaced less than 2 years apart, exhausted women's bodies. Large families were common, both because there was no reliable birth control and because child mortality meant you needed multiple children if you hoped any would survive to adulthood. As the Victorian era progressed, understanding of disease improved. The germ theory of disease gradually replaced the miasma theory. Antiseptic surgery, pioneered by Joseph Lister, dramatically reduced deaths from infection. Anesthesia made surgery survivable. Florence Nightingale's reforms transformed nursing into a profession and hospitals into places where healing might actually occur. Public health measures slowly improved conditions. The Public Health Act of 1848 and subsequent legislation gave local authorities power to improve sanitation, provide clean water, remove sewage. The building of London's sewer system by Joseph Bazalgette was a massive engineering project that dramatically reduced waterborne diseases. Other cities followed, though progress was slow and uneven. By the end of Victoria's reign, death rates were falling. Life expectancy was slowly rising. But for most of the Victorian period, illness and death were constant presences. You knew people who had died young. You attended funerals regularly. You accepted that sickness might strike you or your family at any time. And when it did, you faced it with whatever resources you had, which were usually inadequate. Yet people were remarkably resilient. They nursed sick family members, cared for each other, shared remedies and advice. They adapted to living with chronic pain and disability. They grieved their losses and continued on, because there was no alternative. The acceptance of suffering that characterized Victorian attitudes wasn't callousness, it was survival. You couldn't afford to break down, so you kept going, kept working, even when you felt terrible, kept your family together, even when disease struck, kept hope that tomorrow might be better, even when today was full of pain. Childhood in Victorian Britain was shaped by the era's harsh realities. For ordinary children, life began in difficult circumstances and often didn't improve much from there. Yet within these constraints, children found ways to be children, to play, to learn, to grow up in a world that offered them little but demanded much. Birth itself was dangerous. Women gave birth at home, attended by midwives if they could afford one, or by female relatives and neighbors if they couldn't. There were no hospitals for normal births, no doctors unless complications arose, and even then, only if you could pay. Childbirth was painful, frightening, and frequently fatal. Babies were born into crowded, unsanitary conditions, often in the same room where the family lived and worked. Many didn't survive their first year. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with perhaps a quarter to a third of babies dying before their first birthday in the worst areas and times. Causes included disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the harsh conditions of slum life. For babies who did survive infancy, childhood continued to be precarious. Nutrition was often inadequate. Babies were breastfed if possible, but many working mothers had to return to work shortly after giving birth, leaving their babies with caregivers who fed them pap, a mixture of bread and water or diluted milk that provided little nourishment. Contaminated milk killed many infants. There was no pasteurization, no refrigeration, no understanding of bacteria. Milk was often watered down, sometimes deliberately by dishonest sellers, and it spoiled quickly in summer. Early childhood was spent in whatever cramped space the family occupied. Babies and toddlers were kept relatively confined, as there was no safe place for them to explore. In slum housing, fire from stoves and open hearths posed constant danger. Steep, narrow stairs were another hazard. Many young children were injured or killed in household accidents. Work began early. By age 5 or 6, working-class children were expected to contribute to the family economy. They might mind younger siblings while parents worked, fetch water, run errands, help with household tasks. By age 7 or 8, many were working for wages outside the home. The forms of child labor were varied and almost universally harsh. In textile factories, children as young as 5 or 6 worked as scavengers, crawling under running machinery to collect cotton waste. They worked 12 to 14-hour days in deafening noise, breathing air full of cotton fibers that caused respiratory diseases. Accidents were common. Fingers and hands caught in machinery, sometimes whole limbs. In coal mines, young children worked as trappers, sitting alone in the dark for hours, operating ventilation doors, or as hurriers, hauling carts of coal through low tunnels on hands and knees. The work was exhausting, terrifying, and dangerous. Explosions and roof collapses killed adults and children alike. Chimney sweeps were among the worst off child workers. Small boys were sent up narrow chimneys to scrape out soot, climbing in near total darkness, breathing in toxic soot, sometimes getting stuck or falling. Many developed respiratory problems. Some developed chimney sweeps cancer from constant exposure to soot. The practice was so obviously cruel that it was gradually restricted and eventually banned. But enforcement was difficult, and the practice continued in some places well into the Victorian era. Agricultural children worked in fields, scaring birds, picking stones, helping with harvest. The work was hard, but at least it was outdoors. In cities, children worked in workshops, making matches, sorting rags, assembling goods, any task that small hands could perform for low wages. Street children worked as sellers, beggars, thieves. Some were sent out by parents to earn money however they could. Others were orphans, surviving on their own. The streets of Victorian cities were full of children trying to scrape together pennies, selling flowers or matches, holding horses, sweeping crossings so ladies could cross streets without muddying their dresses. These children were particularly vulnerable to exploitation, abuse, and early death. Child labor slowly declined as the Victorian era progressed. The Factory Acts, beginning in 1833, gradually restricted the employment of children in certain industries. The Mines Act of 1842 banned children under 10 from working in mines. These laws were partially motivated by humanitarian concerns, but also by recognition that children growing up in such conditions made weak, unhealthy adults, which wasn't good for the nation. But enforcement was lax, and poor families depended on their children's earnings. Many continued to work despite the laws. Education, for most of the Victorian period, was not compulsory. Charity schools, Sunday schools, and dame schools provided basic education to some working-class children, teaching reading and basic writing, simple arithmetic, and religious instruction. But attendance was irregular, as children were kept home when their work was needed, and the quality of instruction varied wildly. Some charity schools were excellent, others barely functional. The Education Act of 1870 established a system of board schools funded by local taxes to provide elementary education. The Act of 1880 made school attendance compulsory for children aged 5 to 10, later extended to 12. This marked a major shift. For the first time, working-class children were guaranteed at least a few years of education. The schools taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction. Teaching methods were often harsh, with rote learning, frequent use of the cane for misbehavior, and an emphasis on obedience and discipline. But even basic literacy was transformative. By the end of the Victorian era, most young people could read and write, something that had been rare at the beginning. Family life for working-class children was often chaotic. In tiny, overcrowded homes, there was no privacy, no separate space for children. Babies and young children shared beds with siblings or parents. Older children might sleep on floors or in whatever corner could be found. Discipline could be harsh, with physical punishment common and accepted. But families also provided the only security most children knew. Despite hardship, most parents loved their children, did their best to feed and clothe them, and grieved terribly when they died. Siblings looked after each other, older children caring for younger ones, sharing what little they had. Orphans and children whose parents couldn't care for them often ended up in workhouses. The workhouse was a place of last resort, deliberately made harsh to discourage dependence on public support. Children in workhouses were separated from their parents, dressed in uniforms, and set to work at various tasks. They received minimal education and often inadequate food. Many workhouse children were hired out as apprentices to factories or sent into domestic service, where they worked long hours for little or no pay and were vulnerable to abuse. Despite everything, children found ways to play. Street games required no equipment. Children played marbles, hopscotch, skipping rope, hiding games, ball games with balls made of rags. They improvised toys from whatever they could find. Sticks became swords, old boxes became houses. Wealthier working-class families might afford simple toys, a doll, a spinning top, a ball. But most children's play was imaginative and active, making do with nothing. Childhood diseases were endemic. Most children contracted measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, and other illnesses. Some recovered, many didn't. Parents lived with the constant fear that their child would be the next one taken by disease. The death of children was so common that it was almost expected, but that didn't make it easier. Families mourned deeply, held what funeral they could afford, and tried to continue on. Coming of age happened early. By 12 or 13, working-class children were expected to take on adult responsibilities. Boys might enter apprenticeships or full-time work. Girls went into service or factory work. Childhood, such as it was, ended abruptly. There was no adolescence as we understand it, just a sudden transition from child to worker, from dependent to contributing member of the family economy. Yet for all the hardship, working-class Victorian children weren't merely victims. They were clever, resourceful, often resilient. They learned to navigate a difficult world, to find joy in small things, to support each other. They grew up to become the next generation of workers, parents, citizens. Their experiences shaped them, left marks both visible and invisible, but they endured. And some, through luck or determination, managed to climb out of poverty, to give their own children slightly better lives, continuing the slow, grinding work of generational improvement. Life wasn't all work and hardship. Even the poorest Victorians found moments of pleasure, small escapes from the daily grind that made existence bearable. Entertainment was often simple, cheap, or free, but it was vital, providing relief, connection, and joy in lives that offered too little of any of those things. The pub was the social center of working-class life, especially for men. After a long day of work, men gathered in public houses to drink, talk, and temporarily forget their troubles. The pub was warm when home was cold, well lit when home was dark, and convivial when home was crowded and stressful. You could drink cheap beer, smoke a pipe, exchange news and gossip, complain about employers, and enjoy the company of other men in the same circumstances. Critics worried about working men spending their wages on drink while their families went hungry, and this certainly happened. Drunkenness was a serious problem. But for many men, the pub was one of the few places they could relax, could be something other than a laborer, could feel a sense of belonging. Women were generally not welcome in pubs, which were male spaces. But working-class women had their own forms of socializing. They gathered while doing laundry, while shopping at markets, while minding children in the street. They shared information, helped each other, created networks of mutual support. These informal gatherings were important, providing emotional support and practical assistance that helped families survive difficult times. Music halls emerged in mid-Victorian period and became wildly popular. These were entertainment venues where working people could see variety shows for a small admission fee. The performances included singers, comedians, acrobats, magic acts, and other performers. The songs ranged from sentimental ballads to bawdy comic numbers. The atmosphere was rowdy, with audience members drinking, eating, and sometimes joining in the singing. Music halls provided an evening's entertainment that felt luxurious, a rare chance to see professional performers, to be part of a crowd all enjoying the same show. Street entertainment was free and everywhere. Organ grinders with their mechanical organs and sometimes trained monkeys performed on street corners. Punch and Judy puppet shows drew crowds of children and adults. Acrobats, jugglers, singers, and dancers performed in the streets, hoping for pennies from passers-by. On holidays and special occasions, these street performers multiplied, creating impromptu festivals. Reading, once the province of the educated, became accessible to ordinary people as literacy rates rose. Penny dreadfuls, cheap, serialized stories printed on cheap paper, were enormously popular. They featured sensational tales of crime, adventure, and romance. Working people also read newspapers, which became cheaper and more widely available. By the end of the Victorian era, reading was a common leisure activity, even among the working class. Sports and recreation varied. Men played football in streets and fields, improvised balls and goals. Cricket was popular, though it required more equipment and organization. In industrial towns, factory teams competed against each other. Boxing, both professional and amateur, attracted enthusiasts. Pigeon racing became a working-class pastime, with men keeping racing pigeons in lofts attached to their homes. These hobbies required minimal investment, but provided competition and camaraderie. For children, play was their primary form of entertainment, and they needed little to enjoy themselves. Street games, as mentioned earlier, required no equipment. Children also invented their own entertainments, exploring abandoned buildings, wading in streams, collecting whatever caught their interest. In rural areas, children had fields and woods to explore. In cities, they made do with streets, alleys, and the occasional park. Holidays and outings were special occasions. On bank holidays, working people might take a trip, perhaps to the seaside if they lived within reach of the coast, or to the countryside if they lived in cities. Railway excursion trains, offering cheap tickets for special occasions, made such trips possible for the first time. A day at the seaside, paddling in the water, eating fish and chips was a rare treat that families remembered for years. Christmas gradually became a more elaborate celebration over the Victorian period, though it was nothing like the commercialized holiday we know today. Working families might save up to buy a goose or piece of beef for Christmas dinner, a rare treat. There might be small gifts for children, oranges or sweets, or perhaps a simple toy. The emphasis was on family, on gathering together, on marking the day as special, despite limited means. Religious observance was both a duty and a social activity. Most working people attended church, at least occasionally. Sunday church services provided a break from work, a chance to hear music, to be part of a community gathering. Church socials, bazaars, and other events provided entertainment and fundraising opportunities. For some, religion provided genuine comfort and meaning. For others, it was primarily social obligation. But either way, church was part of the rhythm of working-class life. Courtship and socializing between young men and women happened at work, at church, at markets and fairs. Opportunities to meet were limited, and courtship was often brief. Young couples might walk together on Sunday afternoons, might attend a music hall or fair together. If they decided to marry, and both had jobs and could scrape together enough to rent a room, they did so. Marriage was a practical arrangement, as much as a romantic one. Two people joining resources to improve their chances of survival. Community gatherings marked the seasons and special occasions. Fairs came to town periodically, bringing entertainers, sellers of all kinds, games, and competitions. These were major events that people looked forward to and talked about for months afterward. Harvest festivals in rural areas celebrated the gathering of crops. Bonfire Night, commemorating the gunpowder plot, was marked with fires and fireworks. These communal celebrations created a sense of belonging, of shared culture, that helped bind communities together. Dancing was popular when opportunity arose. At fairs, at weddings, at any gathering where there might be music, people danced. Working people danced traditional folk dances, country dances, and later in the Victorian era, new popular dances. Dancing required no money, just music and willing partners, and it provided exercise, entertainment, and a socially acceptable way for young people to interact. Gardens, when working people had access to them, provided both sustenance and pleasure. A small plot where you could grow vegetables or keep a few chickens wasn't just economically valuable, it was also a source of pride and satisfaction. Some workers rented allotments, small plots of land where they could garden. The work was hard, but seeing things grow, harvesting your own food was rewarding in ways beyond the practical. Gambling was widespread, though officially discouraged. Men bet on anything: horse races, dog fights, cards, dice. The sums were usually small, but the hope of winning, of suddenly having a bit of extra money, was seductive. Most lost more than they won, but the excitement of gambling provided a brief thrill in otherwise monotonous lives. Storytelling and singing were ancient forms of entertainment that continued in Victorian times. Families shared stories in the evenings, passing down folk tales, ghost stories, memories of the past. People sang, both individually and in groups, at work, at home, in pubs. Songs carried news, told stories, expressed feelings, created connections. This oral culture was beginning to fade as literacy spread and commercial entertainment became more available, but it remained important throughout the Victorian era. For all these entertainments, money was always a constraint. Most cost little or nothing, because working people had little or nothing to spend. But they were important nonetheless. They provided moments when you weren't just a laborer, when you could laugh, could enjoy yourself, could feel alive rather than merely surviving. They created memories beyond work and worry, small bright spots in difficult lives. They reminded people that life could offer more than toil, even if those moments were brief and hard-won. Religion and morality were woven through Victorian society in complex ways. The Victorians are famous for their strict moral codes, their emphasis on respectability, their conviction that virtue would be rewarded and vice punished. For ordinary people, these attitudes shaped their lives even when they couldn't fully live up to them. Church attendance was expected. Sunday was the Sabbath, and most working people attended church at least occasionally, many more frequently. There were practical reasons beyond piety. Church provided social connections, potential charitable assistance when times were hard, and it was where you proved your respectability to neighbors and employers. A man who didn't attend church might be viewed with suspicion. A family that never went to services might be judged harshly. The type of church you attended mattered. The Church of England was the established church, but nonconformist denominations, Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, also had large working-class followings. These churches often took more interest in social welfare, running soup kitchens, Sunday schools, and other programs that served the poor. Catholic churches served Irish immigrants and had their own networks of support. For some working people, religion provided genuine comfort. In lives marked by hardship, suffering, and early death, the promise of a better afterlife mattered. The belief that a just God saw your struggles, that your suffering had meaning, that there was ultimate justice beyond this world, these were powerful ideas. Hymns, prayers, and sermons spoke to people's pain and offered hope. Sunday schools taught working-class children to read using the Bible, providing education that parents couldn't give them. For others, religion was more about social obligation than personal faith. You went to church because it was expected, because it was what respectable people did, because it might help you in practical ways: jobs, charitable assistance, social standing. The doctrines might not move you deeply, but you showed up, you listened, you participated. Victorian morality emphasized hard work, thrift, sobriety, sexual propriety, and self-improvement. These values were constantly preached at working people by middle-class reformers, religious leaders, and social commentators. You were told that poverty was often the result of moral failing, that if you just worked harder, drank less, saved more, you could improve your circumstances. This was, of course, largely false. Poverty was structural, the result of low wages, inadequate housing, lack of opportunity. No amount of individual virtue could overcome systematic disadvantage. But the message persisted because it served the interests of those in power, blaming the poor for their poverty rather than examining the conditions that created it. Despite this, many working people internalized some of these values. There was real pride in being respectable, in keeping your home clean even when surrounded by filth, in paying your debts, in staying sober, in avoiding the workhouse. Respectability became a form of resistance, a way of maintaining dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Sexual morality was strictly policed, in theory, if not always in practice. Sex before marriage was condemned, though it happened frequently. Illegitimacy carried enormous stigma, and unmarried mothers faced terrible consequences. They might be turned out by their families, unable to find work, forced into prostitution or the workhouse. Children born outside of marriage were treated as morally tainted, barred from certain opportunities, marked for life. Yet the reality was that many working-class couples lived together before marrying, that pregnancies often precipitated marriages, that sexual behavior didn't always conform to prescribed morality. Prostitution was widespread in Victorian cities. Thousands of women, some estimates said tens of thousands in London alone, worked as prostitutes, mostly because they had no other way to survive. Some were truly fallen women who had made bad choices. But most were simply desperately poor, women who couldn't support themselves through available work, who turned to prostitution as a last resort. Society condemned them while also creating the conditions that forced them into that life. There were periodic campaigns to save prostitutes, to provide them with alternative work, or send them to reformatories where they would learn to be good Christian women. These efforts had mixed success and often failed to address the underlying economic causes. Crime was another moral concern. Working-class neighborhoods had their share of thieves, pickpockets, and worse. Crime was often born of desperation, people stealing to eat, to pay rent, to survive. Punishment was harsh, with transportation to Australia for theft and hanging for more serious crimes persisting through much of the Victorian era. The idea was that harsh punishment would deter crime. It didn't, because people who were starving would take the risk. Gradually, attitudes toward punishment softened, with reformers arguing that prisons should rehabilitate rather than merely punish, but change was slow. There was significant charity work. Middle and upper-class women seeking useful employment for themselves took up charitable work, visiting the poor, distributing aid, trying to improve conditions. Some of this work was genuinely helpful, providing food, clothing, medical care, assistance with rent. But it often came with moral lectures, with judgment, with the assumption that the poor needed to be taught how to live properly. Recipients of charity had to prove they were deserving, that they attended church, that they were sober and hardworking, that their poverty wasn't their own fault. The undeserving poor, those who drank or were judged to be lazy or immoral, were often denied help. Temperance movements urged working people to abstain from alcohol, which was seen as the root of many social ills. Temperance societies organized, held rallies, convinced people to sign pledges promising not to drink. They established coffee houses as alternatives to pubs, provided alcohol-free entertainment, campaigned for laws restricting alcohol sales. Their concerns weren't entirely misplaced. Drunkenness did cause real problems, but they often failed to understand that for many working people, alcohol was one of the few pleasures in lives that offered little else. Social reform movements gradually pushed for improvements. Better housing, sanitation, working conditions, education, all were championed by reformers who saw that individual morality wasn't enough. that the structures of society needed to change. These movements had working-class supporters as well as middle-class ones, people who recognized that poverty and suffering weren't moral failings, but social problems that required social solutions. The Victorian conscience, that sense of moral responsibility and social improvement that characterized the era, produced real changes by the end of Victoria's reign. But it was a long, slow process. And for most ordinary Victorians, moral strictures felt more like judgment than help, another burden in lives already overburdened. The experience of Victorian life depended heavily on whether you lived in the city or the countryside. These were almost two different worlds, with distinct rhythms, challenges, and opportunities. The divide between urban and rural life shaped everything from your daily routine to your health to your prospects for the future. Cities were where industry concentrated, where factories and workshops employed thousands. If you wanted steady work, wages paid in cash rather than kind, access to markets and shops, you went to the city. Migrants flooded in from rural areas throughout the Victorian era, drawn by the promise of employment and the hope of something better than agricultural labor. But what they found was often harsh. Cities were crowded, dirty, disease-ridden. Housing was scarce and expensive. The air was thick with coal smoke and industrial emissions. Streets were clogged with traffic, both horse-drawn and eventually mechanized. The noise was constant. Factory whistles, street vendors, traffic, construction. It was overwhelming, especially for people who had grown up in quiet country villages. But cities also offered opportunities. There were more jobs, more variety of employment. If one factory closed, you might find work at another. There were markets selling goods you couldn't get in the country. There was entertainment, music halls, theaters, shops. There was a certain anonymity, freedom from the social constraints of rural communities, where everyone knew everyone else's business. For young people especially, cities represented possibility, a chance to make your own way without being forever defined by your family and their status in a village hierarchy. Rural life was harder in some ways, easier in others. Agricultural work was seasonal, with intense labor during planting and harvest, less during winter. Wages were lower than in factories, often paid partly in kind, with housing, food, or use of land rather than all cash. This tied workers to their employers in ways that could be oppressive. A farm laborer who complained or caused trouble could lose not just his job, but also his home. Country life was governed by natural rhythms, daylight, weather, seasons. You rose at dawn because that's when work began. You rested at night because you had no artificial light to work by. You ate what was in season, stored food for winter, made do with what the land provided. Life was simpler in some ways, more connected to the natural world, less rushed and frantic than city life. But it was also isolated. If you lived in a small village or on a remote farm, you might go days or weeks seeing the same small circle of people. There was less opportunity, less chance to better yourself. If you were born a farm laborer's son, you would likely be a farm laborer yourself. Social mobility was limited. Tradition and hierarchy more rigid than in cities where change was constant. Rural housing varied widely. Some cottages were snug and well-maintained, with gardens providing vegetables and herbs, with chickens and perhaps a pig. Others were barely habitable, damp, cold, falling into disrepair. Unlike city dwellings, country cottages usually had more space around them, room to breathe, to grow things, to keep animals. This made a real difference to quality of life, providing fresh food and a bit of independence. Health patterns differed between city and country. Rural areas had cleaner air, cleaner water, and less disease transmission. Infant mortality was lower, life expectancy higher. But rural areas also had less access to medical care. If you got seriously ill or injured, you might have to travel miles to see a doctor, and by the time you did, it might be too late. Cities had hospitals, dispensaries, more medical professionals, even if most working people couldn't afford their services. The rural diet was generally better than the urban one. Country people had access to fresh milk, eggs from their own chickens, vegetables from their gardens. They could glean fields after harvest, picking up leftover grain. They might snare rabbits or catch fish, supplementing their diet with food they didn't have to purchase. But they also ate more monotonously, with less variety than city markets offered, especially in winter when fresh food was scarce. Education came later to rural areas. Village schools, when they existed, were often poorly staffed and irregularly attended. Children were needed for farm work, especially during planting and harvest, and were frequently kept home. Literacy rates were lower in rural areas than in cities for much of the Victorian period, though this gap narrowed as the era progressed and education became compulsory. Social life in the countryside centered on different institutions than in cities. The church was more central, as was the local pub. Community gatherings, harvest festivals, fairs were more important when you saw fewer people regularly. There was more sense of community, of mutual obligation, but also more gossip, more judgment, less privacy. Everyone knew their business, had opinions about their lives. This could be supportive or suffocating, depending on your situation. The countryside was changing throughout the Victorian era. Enclosure of common lands continued, pushing small farmers and cottagers off land they'd used for generations. Agricultural methods were modernizing, with machinery beginning to replace hand labor, meaning fewer workers were needed. This displaced many rural people, forcing them to migrate to cities in search of work. Entire communities declined as young people left, leaving behind the old, the very young, and those too settled or too poor to move. Some rural areas maintained traditions that were dying out in cities. Folk songs, dances, crafts, ways of life that had persisted for centuries continued in isolated regions even as cities modernized rapidly. But these were often poverty-stricken areas, picturesque to outside observers, but difficult for those living there. Transportation linked the two worlds. Railways, expanding throughout the Victorian era, connected rural areas to cities. made it possible to move goods and people in ways that had been impossible before. Fresh milk could be sent from country to city, fruits and vegetables transported before they spoiled. Workers could migrate more easily. But railways also accelerated rural decline, making it easier for young people to leave, drawing economic activity toward railway hubs and away from places the railway didn't reach. Some working people experienced both worlds. Agricultural laborers might migrate to cities for winter work when farm work was scarce, then return for harvest. Some workers moved permanently, but maintained connections to their rural origins, sent money back to family, returned for visits. These links between city and country were important, helping both groups survive difficult times. The romanticization of rural life was largely a middle-class phenomenon. Wealthy city dwellers idealized the countryside, wrote poems about it, painted pictures of it, imagined it as wholesome and pure, in contrast to dirty, corrupt cities. But they didn't actually live the hard life of agricultural laborers. For working people, both city and country had advantages and disadvantages. Cities offered work and wages, but at the cost of health and living conditions. The countryside offered cleaner air and better food, but less opportunity and lower pay. Neither was easy, and the best situation was often to have connections to both, to be able to draw on the resources of each while avoiding being trapped in either. The Victorian era was a time of tremendous change, perhaps the most transformative period in British history. Over the course of Victoria's 64-year reign, Britain changed from a largely agricultural nation into the world's first industrial powerhouse. From a society where most people lived in the countryside to one where most lived in cities. From a nation where few could read to one approaching universal literacy. These changes profoundly affected ordinary people's lives, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. The railways were perhaps the most visible symbol of change. At the beginning of Victoria's reign, there were a few hundred miles of railway track. By the end, there were tens of thousands, connecting every major city and many small towns. Railways transformed everything. Food could be transported quickly, bringing fresh produce to cities. People could travel distances that once took days in just hours. Seaside resorts developed, accessible to working people for the first time. The railways created jobs, thousands of them, from navvies who built the lines to drivers, guards, porters, and station staff who operated them. The railway also standardized time, as precise schedules required synchronized clocks across the nation, ending centuries of local time variations. Gaslighting transformed cities. Streets that had been dark and dangerous at night became navigable. Shops could stay open later. Factories could extend their hours. Gaslighting eventually came to homes as well, at least for those who could afford it, ending the tyranny of darkness that had governed human activity since the beginning of time. Later in the Victorian era, electric lighting began to appear, even more transformative, though this was still rare in working-class homes by 1901. The telegraph and later the telephone revolutionized communication. News that once took days or weeks to travel could be transmitted instantly. This shrank the world, made it possible to coordinate activities across vast distances, changed how people thought about time and space. For ordinary people, these technologies were mostly used by others, but their effects rippled through society. Public health improvements, though slow and uneven, eventually made enormous differences. The great sewage systems built in London and other cities in the 1860s and after reduced waterborne diseases dramatically. Clean water supplies, proper drainage, removal of human and animal waste from streets, these unglamorous improvements saved countless lives. By the end of the Victorian era, death rates were falling, infant mortality declining, life expectancy rising. These changes meant children who would have died now lived, meant families could grow larger and stronger. Reform movements achieved real victories. The Factory Acts restricted working hours and improved conditions, especially for women and children. The Mine Acts banned women and young children from underground work. Education Acts made schooling universal and compulsory. The expanding franchise gave more men the vote, bringing political power to the working class for the first time. These changes were fought for, often bitterly opposed by employers and conservatives, but gradually they became law and began to improve lives. Trade unions gained strength despite initial suppression. Workers organized to demand better wages, shorter hours, safer conditions. Strikes, though often broken by employers and police, sometimes succeeded. The threat of strikes gave workers bargaining power they'd never had before. By the end of the Victorian era, unions were legal, recognized, growing in membership and influence. Wages did rise over the course of the Victorian era, not steadily or evenly, but overall. Real wages, what your money could actually buy, increased significantly from the 1850s onward. This meant working families could afford better food, better housing, some small luxuries. The change wasn't dramatic year to year, but over decades it added up. The working class of 1900 was materially better off than their counterparts in 1840. Mass production made goods cheaper. Clothing, household items, tools, even books became more affordable as factories churned out products on scales unimaginable earlier. This had downsides. Mass-produced goods were often lower quality, and traditional craftsmen found their skills devalued. But for working people, cheap manufactured goods meant you could buy things that once would have been impossibly expensive. Immigration changed British society. Irish immigrants fleeing famine came in huge numbers, especially to industrial cities and ports. They faced discrimination, were blamed for crime and disease, competing with English workers for jobs. But they also brought their own culture, their churches, their traditions, becoming part of the fabric of working-class communities. Later in the era, Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe arrived, settling especially in London's East End. They too faced prejudice, but also contributed to the economy and culture. Literacy spread dramatically. At the beginning of Victoria's reign, perhaps half the population could read. By the end, nearly everyone could. This opened new worlds. Working people could read newspapers, keeping informed about politics and world events. They could read books, improving themselves, entertaining themselves, thinking beyond their immediate circumstances. Libraries opened, providing free access to books. Cheap newspapers and magazines proliferated. Knowledge became democratized in ways it never had been before. Leisure time slowly increased. The 10-hour day, once a radical demand, became standard in many industries. Saturday half-holidays appeared, giving working people time for recreation. Bank holidays were established, days when everyone had off and could take trips or attend events. These changes were small but meaningful, giving working people lives beyond work. Political consciousness grew among working people. They read about politics, formed opinions, joined movements demanding change. Chartism. In the 1840s, though it ultimately failed in its immediate aims, mobilized thousands of workers to demand political rights. Later movements for electoral reform succeeded in expanding the franchise. By 1900, working-class men could vote, could run for office, could influence the direction of the nation in ways impossible 60 years earlier. Photography captured Victorian life in ways no previous technology could. Though photography was expensive and most working people never had their photograph taken, the medium documented their world. We have photographs of Victorian streets, working conditions, people in their everyday clothes doing everyday things. This visual record shows us the Victorian world more vividly than any written description. Yet despite all these changes, much remained constant. Poverty persisted. Slums still existed. People still worked long hours for low pay. Disease still killed. The basic structures of class and inequality, though modified, continued. The Victoria who died in 1901 ruled an empire and a nation very different from what she'd inherited in 1837. But the fundamental divide between rich and poor, between those with power and those without, remained. The changes of the Victorian era were real and significant, but they were incomplete. They improved lives in important ways, but didn't solve the underlying problems of industrial capitalism. They brought progress, but progress is never evenly distributed. And working people benefited less than the middle and upper classes. Still, the trajectory was toward improvement, toward greater rights, better conditions, more opportunity. The Victorian era, for all its faults and failures, moved Britain toward a more just, more equitable society, even if that destination remained distant. The lives of ordinary Victorians were not easy lives. They were marked by hard work, poor living conditions, inadequate food, illness, and early death. Most people toiled for long hours, earned little, owned less, and faced an uncertain future with limited hope of improvement. The statistics are stark. Infant mortality rates that would appall us today, life expectancies in the 40s, working hours that seem inhuman, wages that barely covered survival. Yet these dry facts don't capture the fullness of Victorian working-class life. For people were not merely victims of their circumstances, though the circumstances were often terrible. They were human beings who loved, who laughed, who created communities and cultures within the constraints they faced. They helped each other survive. They found small joys. They maintained dignity when the world seemed designed to strip it away. The mother who scrubbed her doorstep every morning, keeping her small corner of the slum as clean as she could manage, was asserting her humanity. The father who worked himself to exhaustion but still found energy to tell his children stories before bed, was giving them something beyond mere survival. The neighbor who shared food when someone else had none, who sat with the sick, who attended funerals, who helped however they could. These small acts of kindness and connection were how people endured. The communities that formed in working-class neighborhoods, despite or perhaps because of the hardship, created networks of mutual support that helped people survive. Victorian society changed enormously over the course of the era, and many of those changes improved working people's lives. Public health measures reduced disease. Education gave children skills their parents never had. Labor reforms limited the worst exploitation. Rising wages meant slowly improving standards of living. By 1901, working-class Victorians were better off in many measurable ways than their counterparts in 1837. Yet suffering and inequality persisted. The gap between rich and poor remained vast. Many changes came too late for those who had already suffered and died. And the improvements that did come were often fought for, demanded, wrung from reluctant governments and employers by working people themselves, organizing and insisting on better. What we can learn from Victorian working-class life is complex. It shows us how much has changed, how many things we take for granted. Clean water, health care, education, workers' rights, weekends would have seemed miraculous to ordinary Victorians. It reminds us that these improvements weren't inevitable, but were won through struggle and sacrifice. It also shows us that human resilience is remarkable, that people can maintain their humanity even in conditions designed to deny it. The mother who scrubbed her doorstep every morning, keeping her small corner of the slum as clean as she could manage, was asserting her humanity. The father who worked himself to exhaustion but still found energy to tell his children stories before bed was giving them something beyond mere survival. The neighbor who shared food when someone else had none, who sat with the sick, who attended funerals, who helped however they could. These small acts of kindness and connection were how people endured. The communities that formed in working-class neighborhoods, despite or perhaps because of the hardship, created networks of mutual support that helped people survive. Victorian society changed enormously over the course of the era, and many of those changes improved working people's lives. Public health measures reduced disease. Education gave children skills their parents never had. Labor reforms limited the worst exploitation. Rising wages meant slowly improving standards of living. By 1901, working-class Victorians were better off in many measurable ways than their counterparts in 1837. Yet suffering and inequality persisted. The gap between rich and poor remained vast. Many changes came too late for those who had already suffered and died. And the improvements that did come were often fought for, demanded, wrung from reluctant governments and employers by working people themselves, organizing and insisting on better. What we can learn from Victorian working-class life is complex. It shows us how much has changed, how many things we take for granted. Clean water, health care, education, workers' rights, weekends would have seemed miraculous to ordinary Victorians. It reminds us that these improvements weren't inevitable, but were won through struggle and sacrifice. It also shows us that human resilience is remarkable, that people can maintain their humanity even in conditions designed to deny it. The echo of Victorian life remains with us. In the buildings they constructed that still stand. In the institutions they created, some of which still exist. In the literature they wrote, which still speaks to us. In the changes they fought for, which shaped the world we inherited. The struggles of ordinary Victorians weren't in vain. Their efforts, their endurance, their small victories and large defeats all contributed to the gradual improvement of working people's lives that continued beyond Victoria's death and continues still. Looking back at their lives from our comfortable present, it's easy to judge, to wonder how people tolerated such conditions, to congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. But it's more valuable to recognize that the people we've been talking about tonight, those workers and servants, those hungry children and exhausted parents, those were people like us, with the same basic desires for security, for love, for meaning, struggling to achieve them in circumstances far more difficult than most of us will ever face. Their stories deserve to be told, not as curiosities or cautionary tales, but as part of the larger human story of which we're all part. They lived, they loved, they worked, they died. They were ordinary Victorians, millions of them, and this was their life. If this quiet journey through Victorian life has helped you relax, if these glimpses into the past have given your mind something to drift on as you fall toward sleep, then please like and subscribe to help our channel continue bringing you these calm historical explorations. And if you found yourself wondering about those Victorian lives tonight, about the mother washing clothes in cold water, the child working in the mine, the old man remembering better days, know that you've connected across time to real people whose struggles and hopes weren't so different from our own. Good night, and may you drift peacefully into dreams, knowing that however hard tomorrow might be, you face it with advantages those ordinary Victorians never had. And that's something to be grateful for.